Well, we're here today with Dr. Sandra Fahy, who is not only a former Korean Studies Institute postdoctoral fellow, but also is now an assistant professor at Sophia University in Tokyo. Dr. Fahy wrote a wonderful book about the refugee and the famine issue and spent 5 years conducting research with the North Korean refugees in both South Korea and Japan. And she's finishing a new book on human rights in North Korea that's going to come out from Columbia University Press in about a year or so, I think. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And the thing that I always say about Sandra is what I've learned from her is that it's probably the most empathetic view of North Koreans that I've ever heard, where probably more than anyone else you have tried to get into how North Koreans view their own world. And it's extraordinary the kinds of insights you had both in the first book, Marching Through Suffering, about how North Koreans understood their lives and why some chose to leave. But also this book about human rights. And that's what we're here today to talk about is, in general, North Korean human rights. A lot of people may have heard about it, but very few people know anything other than North Korea bad. So I wonder if you could start out and maybe just tell us, what are North Korean human rights? What's the situation? What does it look like right now in North Korea?
Well, thanks for the introduction, and yes, I benefited greatly from the postdoc here, and some of the work actually that appears in this second book was written here in the On House.
Great.
North Korea claims to have their own style of human rights, and what they understand by that is that state sovereignty, the state, if you protect the state, then the individuals within that state can be protected. However, a lot of North Korean defectors who began leaving the country in the 1990s were testifying in South Korea and in other countries about atrocious things that were happening to them. I mean, the first thing was, of course, the famine and the food shortage. But the famine and the food shortage led to a lot of other violations. These stories eventually got into the international community and a lot of NGOs were formed. Eventually these NGOs pushed the United Nations to put a commission of inquiry in place.
What's a commission of inquiry?
So the commission was a group of experts. Usually they're academics, but we had the case of Justice Kirby, who is a former judge from Australia, Sonia Brzurko, and Darussalam, I can't remember his first name. These individuals basically appealed to the international community, anybody who wants to come forward and provide evidence. And they additionally invited the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Come forward and testify about your human rights. We want to hear what the situation is. They found widespread, systematic, and gross violations of human rights happening inside the DPRK. They claimed that what's happening in North Korea is without parallel in the contemporary world, that there are crimes against humanity, such that we don't see nowadays. Now, what were those violations? They found that there were people being imprisoned without trial, that in these political prison camps, people were imprisoned for just the most minor infractions that didn't have anything to do, we could think, substantively with a threat, as a threat to the state. Individuals from, for instance, North Korea's broadcasting system who had misspoken during a broadcast or who'd put a typo into some part of the text of the Rodong Shinmun and were put into a political prison camp. They also found that there is torture happening within these prison camps, some of it which is left over from the Japanese colonial period. They also found there are cases of disappearances. There are cases of people being refouled from China and then being brought into the political prison camp system, and also, of course, widespread starvation that the state is aware of and is not taking any precautions to ameliorate.
So how many people are in these prison camps?
Estimates about who is in the prison camps is very difficult to assess because North Korea denies their existence and denies any access to the population of the prison camp proper or the political prison camps. There are estimates between about, I think, 50,000 and 200,000, so it's very difficult to assess.
Okay.
Also, North Korea keeps changing these political prison camps, where they're located,
Sure.
and this has happened especially since the publication of the Commission of Inquiry report.
Okay, so the 200,000 or so, 100 to 200,000 in the prison camps clearly suffer immense torture and violations and things like that,
Yes.
right? That leaves 24 million other people in North Korea. So of the 24 million others, what is their life like? If you don't happen to be in the prison camps, how are the human rights for those people who aren't?
So the situation is quite nuanced and I think difficult to appreciate, because the representation of North Korea is that people are that it's a slave country, or that everybody, it's a kind of country that is a political prison camp onto itself, or that people are
They're
robotic.
all brainwashed, exactly.
Yeah,
brainwashed
you've written
robots.
about this,
Yeah.
I've written about this.
So that's not true.
Well, it's really interesting. If you listen to, and I listened to all of the public hearings that the United Nations Commission of Inquiry held. They had held public hearings. This is freely available online. Anybody can listen and watch. And if you listen to the North Korean defectors, what you hear is a lot of the times there's a phase in which they observed public executions, that they witnessed things that to us might seem rather atrocious, and then they interpret it as, this is the way life is here. But then there are a few people who kind of instinctively felt, no matter what, this thing is still wrong. I don't care what the political system is here. I still feel that this is a wrong way to treat a fellow human. So that's kind of interesting to think about. So that there's some element we have to recognize that the ideology plays a huge role in shaping how people perceive events in their day-to-day life. Now, having said that, that's one layer. But the human rights as they are experienced in North Korea are, I describe it as happening on a topology. So it's a sort of map,
Okay.
meaning that they kind of coexist. So let's take this example of the food situation. And we can still say that North Korea is not food secure. North Korea, the state, should be taking its money and purchasing food and bringing food into the country. Instead, they take money and use it to build nuclear weapons, use it to
Disneyland, or
right. They use it in all kinds of
an
ways
amusement park
that prioritize other things than the well-being of their people, than the well-being of infants that are being born, for instance. So if you don't have access to food, then you're going to try to alter your access to food. And because North Korea doesn't allow entrepreneurship, doesn't allow people to move within their profession, doesn't allow, because they have the Songbun system that discriminates, if you have a family that's...
Tell us what that is.
The Songbun system in North Korea basically is looking at the political lineage, or we could say political race of an individual, mapped way back to when Korea was unified. So where were your parents, your grandparents?
Were they revolutionaries? Were they,
exactly. And this sort of genealogy is going to shape your access to a profession. It even shapes who can date whom, who can marry whom.
So the most privileged get all, the highest up on this system, on this caste system, have tremendous access. If your grandparents happen to not be revolutionaries, you could be at the bottom and have no access to mobility, to life. Is that
absolutely,
education?
Absolutely. So a lot of North Koreans describe it as just being unable to have any kind of dreams, because they were already kind of channeled into, working in the mines, because that's where their parents worked, or this type of thing. And absolutely no political mobility. You can move down the Songbun, but you could never move up. Yes.
Okay. So this typology of, tell us more what you mean by this sort of map, or this typology of human rights.
The thing that I wrote about in my first book was that we always talk about human rights violations in a plural. So they're always coexisting. So you can't just pull out one. You couldn't just have, the fact that they're tortured, okay, so let's just stop torturing them. Or, that the fact that people are being tortured exists also in an environment where there's no freedom of opinion, there's no access to, freedom of the press, et cetera, et cetera. So you have a situation where people aren't able to get access to food. They commit crimes in order to get access to food. And these crimes make them vulnerable to injury and other sorts of unfortunate events.
And then they get punished for the crimes.
And then they get punished for those crimes, whether directly or indirectly, and sometimes those punishments are carried with them for the rest of their lives. Into their defection into China, where they face other punishment, and into South Korea as well. So there's legacies of this sort of suffering that goes on.
You said once that access to food is a human right. What do you mean by that? Because when we think about human rights, we tend to think of, as you said, torture or lack of information or something. How is access to food a fundamental human right?
Well, in terms of the United Declaration of Human Rights, Article 25 states that we should have the right to freedom from hunger and the ability to access food. So if the state, as North Korea claims, is going to provide everything for people, education, housing, food, healthcare, all of these things, then, okay, the state should provide them. If the state doesn't provide those things, then they should at least entitle people to alter their access to these things.
And they haven't done that. Right. So
they criminalize that. So if you try to go to the black market and buy drugs because you've got cancer or you've got a tumor or you've got some sort of pain, then, having those drugs or even selling them could be criminalized in North Korea.
haven't they allowed markets? Don't they allow grain markets?
Well,
Yes,
absolutely. North Korea has allowed some of this black market activity and they turn a blind eye to it. But the unfortunate thing is that it's totally unregulated. So you have people selling things
it's still
and
formally
buying
illegal.
things.
I see.
Yes. But also buying and selling things on the black market that can't be regulated. So people using the wrong kind of drugs to treat illnesses that are undiagnosed or misdiagnosed and things like this. So
I see. Okay.
Yeah.
One other question about when we're just trying to get a picture of North Korea then in terms of the human rights. So probably at the most extreme end are 100, 200,000 in these camps, which sounds life is horrific. Right?
Yes.
When I read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago,
yes.
when I was in high school, it's life-changing to read what prison camps are like in the Soviet Union.
Yeah,
you
I
read
agree.
some of the defector stories of
Yes.
prison camps in North Korea, horrifying. 24 million other people have different access, different issues. Is everyone the same? I mean, so some of the most privileged lead a good life. How would you sort of describe the general existence of, say, the average North Korean, if there is such a thing? Or would you even resist conceptualizing it that way?
Well, I think it's likely that the majority are content or at least enduring the status quo. And indeed, there are factors that contribute to this. So the lack of information in North Korea, I think, is one of the key situations that keeps the status quo in place. So people don't even know their own criminal code. Like, that wasn't available within North Korea until 2006. So they didn't know what was legal and what was
So
illegal.
the government could
except for
always
an
decide
unspoken-
whatever they wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's lots of broad gray nuance in North Korea's criminal code. So what could be worthy of getting, capital crime, so to be publicly executed or executed. Now they have secret invisible executions as well in North Korea.
Yeah.
What could get that is quite loosely defined. But I think because of the lack of information, a lot of people are happy with the status quo. I mean, there are loads of factors that keep people quiet and keep them not resisting the system. So there are big things such as knowledge of the political prison camps and knowledge that if you complain or if you question, then you and your whole family are going to be put in the prison camp. But then there are other more subtle things like the fact that you know your community and you're familiar with life and you might have some basic comforts like, friends and family around you that keep you from making the ultimate choice of leaving.
You don't easily give those up if you've got them. So there's, in a way, there's what you're getting to, and this makes a nice transition, is why does North Korea behave the way it does, or why hasn't it changed, and what are outside countries trying to do? Part of what that leads me to is an interesting question about why haven't people inside protested more, and it seems you're providing an argument that there is, in some ways, the repression is very useful, but in other ways people have to make a much more stark choice than we tend to think about. Can you help flesh that out a little bit? Like, why hasn't it collapsed yet? Because it seems horrific.
Yes. I am of the view that North Korea hasn't collapsed because it's containing the resistance through its political prison camps, whether in the camps themselves or through knowledge of the camps that kind of forces people to self-censor, forces them to make sure that they don't do anything that's going to make themselves or their family or their friends suffer at all. The other thing that we have to remember is that we have now in South Korea about 27,000 North Korean defectors. We're not sure how many are in China because China is contributing to a whole host of other human rights violations for North Koreans, and particularly North Korean women. But there might be about 100,000 in China. Those individuals, I think we need to begin to see their choice to leave as an act of resisting. They're opting out.
Obviously, yeah.
They're opting out of a system that doesn't allow them to alter it, that has refused to allow them to alter it.
So refugees are an element of the human rights problem, right? They're an example of it,
yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Or a symptom of it.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
Is it going up? Is it going down? How is the refugees just as an example of this, or as an indicator of?
Well, since Kim Jong-un has come to power, there have been kind of ebbs and flows in terms of the movement of refugees. Arguments that that Kim Jong-un has cracked down on the border and made it more difficult for people to leave and things like that. Okay. Liberty in North Korea, that NGO, has a lot of insights into this. And
I see. Mm-hmm. Okay.
But,
so why do you think? What are outside countries doing? What's the United States trying to do? COI. There's a commission of inquiry. Mm-hmm. South Korea, what are we doing? We've got sounds like a horrific situation in North Korea. Mm-hmm.
Well, up to this point, a lot of the international community has been focused on North Korea's nuclear proliferation issues, which is completely legitimate because that could, perform the ultimate human rights violation on all of us if it were to, if we were to be targeted. And so as a result of that, the United Nations Security Council has placed all kinds of sanctions on North Korea.
Yeah, sure.
This year, since the United Nations Commission of Inquiry report, that report recommended to the Security Council, please put North Korean human rights permanently on your agenda. And they have also encouraged the UN to recommend Kim Jong-un to the International Criminal Court.
For crimes against humanity? For
crimes against humanity, absolutely. And for, other individuals in government or throughout the system that are delivering human rights violations to people to be held to account. Now what we're seeing, there's a resolution by the United Nations 2270, and they're particularly interested in kind of pinching North Korea economically. So this is the greatest amount of sanctions we've seen on North Korea. So all the banking systems are cut off, and it's actually making things quite difficult for humanitarian organizations inside. But we have to wait and see, because this is just January of this year it happened. We have to see what kind of impact this will have. I'll just say one thing. Victor Cha identified that in 2005 and in this year, and with the United Nations COI, these were the two times when North Korea was sort of taken by surprise by the way the international community has reacted to it. So we're kind of at a wait and see time for this.
There are two things going on. Number one, are sanctions actually going to work? Yeah. And then number two, you just said earlier that the biggest element to change in North Korea is information to North Korean people. Mm-hmm. That's one of those key things. And it strikes me that trying to cut them off is how we're not going to get information. So I wonder, do you think the sanction is going to work? Mm-hmm. And is it getting more information to the North Korean people, or is it isolating? Because it sounds like some of these things are actually hurting the people on the ground if they're not getting humanitarian aid and food.
Yes.
And things like that.
Yes.
Right. So how do you sort out these very complex, different causal, different issues?
Yes, absolutely. And it's something, I think that's the reason why we are in the position where we are. In my view, in my assessment, I think we are not being creative enough in how we're approaching this situation. So for instance, absolutely more information needs to be delivered into North Korea, and there are some organizations that could be supported more because there's information coming out of North Korea, and that's what we're interested in. Formerly, it's been information coming out with defectors. Mm-hmm. Now what we want is information coming out of North Korea from people who are staying inside. And we want to be able to send more information back to them. So, for instance...
For actual two-way interaction with North Koreans who are still in North Korea. That's That's an interesting thing.
Yes.
Go ahead.
If you listen to North Korean defectors, in particular defectors who were interviewed with the Commission of Inquiry in the public hearing, they say that there are people deep inside North Korea who are very displeased with the political system and want to see change. If you look at, for instance, the work of Asia Press, they have a group called Rimjingang, which was formed by North Korean defectors. I've
got a book, it's here somewhere.
Yeah, I sent you their work. This is a group, it's fascinating what they're doing because they have met people in the border region with China, provided them with cameras and other kinds of equipment, and are producing underground journalism from within North Korea. These groups have to be supported more. We need to do more with Radio Free Asia. There has to be much more of a dialogue. There needs to be much more aid aimed or activism aimed at women inside North Korea. Women and I think young people in North Korea are very disenfranchised and are very displeased with the military, who are soldiers who are actively taking advantage of communities. There are loads of children who are orphaned, who are not getting access to education. The Changmadang, the market generation, they think very differently than the older generation. So there's a lot of opportunity, and there is dissent inside North Korea. The issue is that we need to facilitate the growth of that dissent.
So how does that? How do you slice or thread that needle between interacting with underground journalists, humanitarian aid for food, as you pointed out, people are starving right now, helping get a dialogue with people in there, versus the most stringent type of sanctions that we've had on North Korea? I mean, is there a way that we can think about?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't think we should have one or the other. I think we need to have a multifaceted approach. It's interesting to me to think about what an extremely strong economic sanction situation looks like in North Korea, while at the same time we're providing aid to underground groups. Another sort of thing that we're not seeing, that we should be seeing more of, is, for instance, you have a group I used to work with in South Korea. They used to be called NK Gulag, and now I think they're called No Fence or something. Anyway, based in South Korea. And they are the ones, Pak Sang-hak and all these guys who are sending the helium balloons into North Korea with all of this information.
Yes.
I think it's fascinating and very dynamic.
Do you think it works?
Though it breaks the national security law of South Korea.
Does it work,
and North.
do you think? Has there any influence that people get these things?
Absolutely it works. Absolutely.
So they get these leaflets, they're like, wow.
So first I would say to you, we have to kind of, as an academic, I suppose, I would say, well, what does working look like? Does working look like, because within these packages, they're sending $1 bills, and they have propaganda information inside. So that $1 can actually purchase a lot on the black
I'm sure the
black
dollar.
marketing.
I'm sure they use the dollar. Yes.
Right, and you yourself were saying, how do we measure when a human rights violation is ameliorated? Does it count if it's just one person?
Yeah.
So if you have a gotjebi, like an orphan child, finding these, you don't know what that could do for that child's life.
So some of these are sending balloons over with a bunch of stuff in there, as you said. So so Kochebi gets $1. What else? What happens? What they float around? Tell me how this works.
Well, there are a few different ways that it works. Obviously, if you're a North Korean, you're going to be really suspicious. There was some candy that was sent over across the DMZ, and the soldiers were suspicious of it. And of course, it could be poisoned. Who knows what it could be? Wouldn't it be fabulous to poison all the soldiers on the DMZ, and then you could just go north, right?
Walk,
yeah, very weird way to, break the DMZ. But so what the soldiers did was they unwrapped the candy and they kind of left it to see like how the ants would react or how different animals would react if they ate it. And they were fine. So then they ate it themselves.
Interesting, yeah.
So it's kind of interesting to think how these items are interpreted and then how they're engaged with or altered when they're inside North Korea proper. So some people are getting this propaganda and thinking, well, this is South Korean information. We don't really call it propaganda, but they're getting this information and, they're just tossing it away because they don't care.
Using the dollar.
They're not interested.
Yeah.
Their whole lives are surrounded by propaganda. They don't really want any more, right? And they just take the dollar and they're going to be using it somehow. But in other ways, they're learning from it.
Well, let me push you on that, because there's something else, which is like, So they get $1, right? Or so we send over something with a balloon that has like an American flag or whatever, right? Does that change the way they view America or their own? Like,
Well, how, you know,
like, hey, we got this food with an American flag on it. America must be great.
yes,
We're number one, right?
Yes.
So how does that work?
yes. You know, the propaganda is sent over, and we had that propaganda in terms of the United Nations World Food Program that had the US flag on it, or the Japanese flag, or whatever. And the interpretation was that
We thought.
yes, our interpretation was that they're going to see the flag and think, they're caring for us. My state is not caring for me. My passions or my heart is divided.
Yeah.
And I'm going to go in the direction of where I'm fed, because historically,
Sure.
that's where loyalties go.
Yeah.
And it wasn't the case. In fact, North Korea readily propagated to people that that aid was an apology for the war. It was an apology for how the Japanese had treated Koreans during the colonial era. That this was, it was the humbling of the West to North Korea for all of our errors. So the meaning of it was totally remade, and then whoever got access to it, which again, this is another issue because it's very few people who get access to this, primarily soldiers and those in elite positions in North Korea and in those communities. So.
Why do you think then what we thought would happen is different than how they interpreted it?
Well, another example of that would be like bicycles or foreign goods coming in to
Sure,
North
exactly,
Korea.
right?
So
We can't make them, but
yeah, they
other
see this
countries can.
bicycle
Yeah.
is made from Japan, or this refrigerator, again, very rare in North Korea, is made in Japan, so these goods must be good, you know, so we interpret like that the fact, you know, and the meaning come together when they move into North Korea, but the fact and the meaning don't move together.
And they
you know,
interpret it.
facts don't come with their meaning attached. So the meaning that's given to that beautiful bicycle, that refrigerator, that World Food Program sack of cornmeal, the meaning of it, which is that we want you to have democracy, we want you to have food, we want you to be able to have a liberated existence, that meaning is totally divorced from it. And the meaning that is given to it inside North Korea is, this is given to you because these countries feel so bad about how they have behaved in the past.
Which again shows how difficult it is for outside countries to force change. And in some ways, how North Koreans are interpreting their own existence is in many ways different than what we assume that it would be, right? This is fascinating.
Absolutely. So from my analysis, what I see, there's a need, not only in the United States, but in other countries' governments, to produce some sort of body which is aimed at understanding North Korean propaganda. North Korea propaganda that's produced domestically, and then North Korea propaganda that's put out internationally, because that's going to tell us how North Korea is interpreting how we behave and what we are doing, because they're watching everything and interpreting everything and then feeding it to their population in a particular way. So if we can understand how they're producing this information domestically, then we can then think of ways to counter it.
Yeah. Interesting. So, what is the United States? We have sanctions. We have a commission on inquiry.
Well, the United Nations,
yes, the UN did
has
that, but the United States
and the United States has its own
agrees with-
sanctions,
Okay.
and there are many countries that have their own individuated sanctions to North Korea.
Okay.
The U.S.'s sanctions are critical, though, because the U.S. dollar is a primary means of economic exchange globally.
Yeah.
So if you want to send money between Japan and Iceland, you're not going to send it in yen. You're going to send it in U.S. dollars.
Yeah.
So the same thing for other countries when they deal with North Korea. They're not going to send the money in North Korean won. They're going to send it in U.S. dollars. So if the United States can put a sanction on that, which is completely legitimate for them to do, then they can cut off North Korea economically.
So, are North Korea's human rights getting better? Are they getting worse?
In my estimation, the situation seems to be getting worse. North Korea is getting more secretive. It's moving the prison camps, or it's kind of dismantling some. Yeah, I mean, if you look in the 70s, things were not so bad in North Korea. Yes, there was no access to free information. There was no free press. There was discrimination of ethnic Koreans who had come from Japan. There were abductions. There were disappearances. But then in the late 80s, with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, all the problems that came about with the collapse of the Soviet bloc in those countries emerged in North Korea too, but North Korea didn't collapse. So those problems were contained inside North Korea.
Festering.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, disease, economic crimes, all these things started to bubble up, and they've been bubbling up in North Korea. While they bubbled up but were resolved in the former Soviet bloc.
Yeah.
And then, there was the economic, the currency reform in North Korea. That created all kinds of problems. And then, the death of Kim Jong-il, that created some sort of shakes and problems inside North Korea. And then, we have Kim Jong-un, and he is, many argue, much more extreme than his father or his grandfather politically.
Okay.
So in my opinion and in my analysis, things are not improving inside North Korea. And if I can say on this point as well, scholarship by Hafner Burton, who's down in San Diego, she shows that naming and shaming campaigns, which we've been doing toward North Korea since the 2000s, she doesn't do her work precisely on North Korea, but she examines how naming and shaming campaigns don't always work to improve human rights violations and sometimes make it worse or push it even more secretly underground. So this is something for us to wait and see and to look at.
So a commission of inquiry is important, but naming and shaming doesn't always work.
Yes.
Sanctions are important, but they often cause a reaction in North Korea.
Yep.
Interacting with North Korea, even getting more information, it's interpreted by North Koreans differently than we think when we even give them aid.
Yes.
That's a pretty pessimistic view.
Yes, absolutely.
North Korea, yes, I think all of us, for all of us who've been trying to change North Korea, or have hoped for change in North Korea, having done it for decades, we're still either in the same place or things are getting worse, right? Is there any way to sort of conclude on what are the grounds for optimism, or what would the grounds forward be, in your opinion, given that all of us have seen essentially no change or just regression in North Korea?
Yeah. North Korea's system is entropic. It is inherently an entropic system. It is destroying itself. How do we know that? Look at what they're doing politically to their people. They are forcing them to commit, or compelling them to commit crimes that are placing them in greater and greater degrees of vulnerability, not only within their country, but in China and other countries. So this is not sustainable. It's absolutely not sustainable. If you look, even in terms of the leadership, that entropic system is beginning to unravel. So that's the first thing.
Okay.
But the second thing that we have to recognize is that, like I said before, I think we need to be a little bit more creative in how we're looking at these problems together. So, for instance, in one of the chapters of my book, I talk about migration in North Korea, and I also talk about imprisonment in North Korea, and I link this up with health. So people who are migrating are more likely to be ill because they can't get access to healthcare. And people who are migrating, both within North Korea and into China, are more likely to be imprisoned or returned to North Korea. Once returned to North Korea in the prison camp, they're more likely to get ill. So for instance, one of the biggest problems in North Korea in terms of health is tuberculosis and multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. That's a problem not only for those people, but for North Korea itself. So as an example, we need to say to the North Korean state, look, we've identified a problem in your country that is actually in your interest to take care of. And in order for you to take care of it, you need to target the most vulnerable. In order for you to survive politically, you actually need to take care of the people you dislike the most. If you don't take care of the people that you dislike the most, your end is so near. And I think when we can spell this out to North Korea, that, for myself, I have no political agenda. I only care for people to have access to good rights, or to be able to alter their access to good human rights. And, to just point out to them, allow things to continue as they are, and soon it will end.
And you can see that.
Absolutely, soon it will end.
That's very powerful. So, This has been a wonderful conversation, so thank you.
Yeah.
It's always great to have you back.
I agree. Thank you.
Are there any final observations you'd like to make as we conclude?
Well, we were speaking before about the helium balloons going into North Korea and the young orphan, the Gochebi, who might find the dollar, and then, you know, who knows what that might change for them. So I do think that if you can improve one individual's life, even a little bit, if you can ameliorate their human rights violations even a little bit, then that is...
It's progress.
Yes, absolutely. And you never know where that's going to go. Yeah. And how do we know that you never know where that's going to go? Because look at what all the defectors are doing, the young defectors are doing in the international community with their memoirs, with their activism and things like that. So we have no idea. But it's... Even though the human rights situation in North Korea, in my opinion, is getting worse, the activism is getting much more powerful. And that's very exciting to see.
Is there a final question? Are there ways for anyone who's watching this video to get involved?
Yes, there are loads of ways for people to get involved. So if you are in any country, pretty much, in the West or in Europe, I believe also they're based in Asia, Liberty in North Korea is a group that I would strongly recommend people get in touch with. People who are in the medical community, I would encourage them to get in touch with Friends in Health, which is a group out of Harvard University, run by some excellent physicians that work directly with the North Korean Medical Association.
Great.
I would also encourage people to get in touch with Radio Free Asia and to do some work with them. Of course, Asia Press, based in Japan, with Rim Jin-gang, the people who are doing the underground journalism in North Korea. And also, I would encourage people to, particularly people in China, to press their government, and people to internationally press their governments to raise awareness about North Koreans' human rights.
Wow. There's a lot that needs to be done. So thank you so much, Sandra, for doing this. I think it's been wonderful. Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.